no let-up in Russian attacks on Ukraine. But why should there be? President Putin is getting what he wants without having to stop or make concessions. First of all, a new partnership with the USA. Americans on the left, Russians on the right. The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio was the ostensible leader of the US delegation, but President Trump's special envoy and real estate buddy Steve Witkoff may be the most important member of the team.
It was positive, upbeat, constructive. Everybody there to get to the right outcome, solution-based. We discussed it afterwards. We couldn't have imagined a better result after this session. It was very, very solid.
Despite his Spartan surroundings, the Russian foreign minister was as upbeat as he can be.
The conversation was, I think, useful. We didn't just listen, but heard each other. And I have reason to believe that the American side has become more understanding of our position, which we have once again presented in detail and with specific examples on the basis of President Putin's multiple statements.
The last time the US and Russian leaders met was in 2019, 3 years before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. President Putin was then shunned by the West. But now America and Russia will renew diplomatic contacts, explore closer ties and the lifting of sanctions, as well as nominate teams to start negotiations about the war, at some point, including Ukraine and Europe.
There are other parties that have sanctions. The European Union is going to have to be at the table at some point because they have sanctions as well that have been imposed. So, but I guess the point here is the goal is, and we agreed on what the goal is to bring an end to this conflict in a way that's fair, enduring, sustainable, and acceptable to all parties involved.
The Russian delegation included the head of their sovereign wealth fund, maybe because they suspect that the way to President Trump's heart is through his wallet.
We can do a lot in the economic area. It's very important to understand that US businesses lost around $300 billion from leaving Russia. So there is huge economic toll on many countries from what's happening right now. And we believe the way forward is through solutions, through problem solving.
President Zelenskyy of Ukraine was in Turkey today. He paid his respects at the tomb of Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey. He cut a solemn figure. History threatens to leave him behind, as his most important ally, the USA, turns its back and embraces his enemy.
Lindsay Hilson. Well, our Washington correspondent Siobhan Kennedy joins me now. Siobhan, what's the latest?
Well, Matt, unusually for President Trump, he hasn't made any comment on the meeting today. He's still down in Florida where he's been for the long holiday weekend. He's expected to pop up later to announce yet more executive orders and will no doubt then heap praise on what can only be described as a historic meeting today, a truly stunning reversal given where relations were between Biden and Putin, essentially non-existent. Biden, remember, had gone out of his way the past 3 years to make Russia into a pariah state. But President Zelenskyy has been reacting this morning. He's cancelled his trip to Saudi Arabia so as not to give legitimacy to today's meeting between the US and Russia, which of course did not include him or anyone from Europe. He stressed today that he hadn't been invited to the meeting and that he didn't want anything happening behind our backs, he said. No decision can be made without Ukraine. Now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio was asked about Zelenskyy in Europe feeling sidelined today. Interestingly, he did not give the reassurance that he did over the weekend when he was in Jerusalem, which was to say that Ukraine and Europe would be at the table for any substantive talks and that any settlement would have to respect Ukrainian sovereignty. There was none of that talk today. Instead, Marco Rubio simply said that the world should be thanking President Trump for getting the peace talks today as far as they have.
Siobhan, thanks very much indeed. Well, earlier I spoke to John Herbst, who served as US ambassador to Ukraine under the Republican President George W. Bush. And I started by asking him if he believed that the Americans are wedded to the idea, as they say they are, of a sovereign Ukraine at the end of these talks.
I think that that is the Trump policy to achieve that. And while today may not have been a clear step in that direction, they think it is, the Trump administration.
But do you think they have a realistic path to that goal? Because that's not what the Russians will accept. It's probably one of the Russian red lines.
Well, I think you're right. The Russians won't accept a sovereign Ukraine. And Trump has said if they're not willing to accept it, then we have to put pressure on them to make them accept it.
Wouldn't it have been better for the Americans to involve Ukraine in the talks today, or the Europeans?
I think that might have been preferable. I don't think it's essential.
But you can understand why the Ukrainians and indeed the Europeans are perplexed by what the administration has been doing, because not once in his readout of the telephone conversation between President Trump and Vladimir Putin did Trump say, did Trump condemn the act of aggression against Ukraine?
I agree with you on that. But Trump did say in that news conference last week, where he made some other statements which were not helpful, that, we have to continue presenting aid to Ukraine because Putin may want to go farther into Ukraine and we can't let him do that. That was a very huge, right there, laying out a very clear red line, which should reassure people. The best would be doing something that neither Biden has done nor has Trump seemed willing to do, which is to arm Ukraine to the hilt right now so they could kick Russian forces out of Ukraine. That is not Trump's view. His view is to establish a compromise peace which would be durable. It's not a crazy plan. It's not a plan which is obscured, but it is a plan that people don't fully see because they are sometimes confused by his tactics.
But Trump prides himself on being a transactional deal maker. He keeps going on about that book that he wrote or was written for him,
Correct.
The Art of the Deal.
Correct.
Is it the art of the deal to basically make nothing but concessions before the talks have even started?
At this point, the only concessions you can say Trump has made are rhetorical or process-based, not substantively based. But we've seen an approach like this before during Trump's first term as he reached out to the North Koreans. And that looked unseemly at the time. But when he concluded that he was not going to get what he needed on substance from the dictator in Pyongyang, he walked away. And I think what we're seeing is a replay of that type of approach today. Now, that is not my preferred approach. I think the right approach with Moscow is demonstrate you've got some steel.
But actually, since that meeting, North Korea has armed, has doubled down on its nuclear armament. It's got, long-range missiles. It is no weaker than it was at the time when Trump met him.
Well, correct, but people were afraid he was going to give away the store, and he didn't. But I'm just describing to you the way Trump approaches negotiations, and his outreach to Kim was not a disaster, although people were talking about it at the time the same way now people are talking about his outreach to Putin.
So just finally, as someone who used to live in Kyiv as an American diplomat, are you confident that Ukraine, or what's left of it, will be there as an independent sovereign nation in control of its own borders?
I think it is much more likely that Ukraine will emerge as a sovereign state in relatively secure circumstances. I am not confident, I'm not going to say, given the Trump approach, that the peace he may achieve will be a just peace, because his view is to allow Russia to occupy part of Ukraine. But it could be a durable peace.
John Herbst, thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Herbst.
You're welcome.
Well, a short while ago, I also spoke to Mikhail Kazyanov, who was Russian Prime Minister in 2000, after Vladimir Putin became president, a job that he held until 2004. I started by asking him if he thought that Mr. Putin was getting everything that he wants at the moment.
Yes, absolutely. Just that what's taking place right now, all these rhetorics, that's some kind of, I would say, rehabilitation of Putin's image on the international scene. I think he's happy to hear just that U.S. administration is ready to discuss global issues, geopolitics with him, and restoration of relations, Russia's U.S., and economic exploration in the Arctic, and many, many other things, and a little bit of potential problems in Ukraine.
So when you look at that image today in Saudi Arabia of Sergei Lavrov sitting opposite Marco Rubio, and the officials on either side, but no Ukrainian present, no European present, what does that image tell you?
In fact, there is such a style of negotiations when the mediator would like first to understand the position on one side and then the position on the other side, and then try to make their positions, bring their position closer. But the image what they created today, just trying to fulfill all Putin's expectations and to raise his image, that's destroying just such an approach. That's why just it is not quite clear what was the result of this. In fact, it was just the image that the United States is ready to accept Putin's demands.
Right. Is there anything that you've seen so far or that you've heard so far that indicates that the Russians, that Vladimir Putin has had to make any concession at all?
No, he is not prepared. He doesn't want to give any concessions this month, because today Putin feels himself strong and stable in terms of economy and financial status of the federal government, federal budget government, and also just his slow but military operation and continue invasion, and he quite successfully moving and suppressing Ukraine. And today he is not prepared to give concessions. He has to be forced, and some problems should be created, and immediate problems for him in economy, first of all, so that he would understand he cannot finance the war anymore.
President Putin wants to turn Ukraine into a kind of Belarus, a Russian vassal state. The Americans have said they want Ukraine to be independent and sovereign, which is obviously what the Ukrainians and the Europeans want. Which Ukraine do you think will survive at the end of these talks?
I believe that in a few months, just the whole this environment will be reconsidered. All those issues just right now, which are under discussion, will be reconsidered. And I believe and hope that Great Britain and European Union would reconsider their approach and just create immediate just urgency fund to start purchasing equipment and ammunition from the United States, because Europe doesn't produce enough to provide to Ukraine right now. Mr. Trump would be happy just to sell, and that is an important issue. And I'm sure that appropriate security guarantees will be provided for Ukraine.
Just to sum up briefly, although Mr. Putin has had a very good day today, what you're saying is that he's not going to have it all his own way in the coming months.
He would wish to meet with President Trump, to have pictures, to have hugs or something like this, just because he needs, and internally that is like raising his legitimacy outside and showing Russian people that how strong he is. But on a later stage, the real agreement will not be achieved. The only way, that is, if the United States accept Putin's victory. But I'd like to exclude such a scenario.
Mr. Kasyanov, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
After the Russians invaded 3 years ago, the UK government set up schemes to allow Ukrainians to escape the fighting, and more than 200,000 are thought to have come here. Andy Davis has been speaking to some of them to find out what they make of Donald Trump's decision to start talking to the Russians again.
For many of the Ukrainians now living in Chepstow in South Wales, the upcycled coffee shop has become a favourite spot. The charity which runs it has been central to local fundraising around Ukraine. And it's where this afternoon we met Marat Hajayev, a bridge engineer, and his wife Katerina Hajayeva, an administrator. Natalia Piruch trained as a lawyer. Katerina Ludwin is a financial analyst. Their husbands are in Ukraine.
So that is the image today of the Russians and the Americans meeting in Saudi Arabia. How do you feel about what's happened in Riyadh today with the Americans meeting the Russians like this?
I'm very sad that the fate of Ukraine is decided between Putin and Trump.
What do you fear might happen?
I'm afraid there will be a ceasefire. They will stop the war now, but Russians will come again with increased capacity and destroy everything.
There mustn't be any agreement about Ukraine without Ukraine. And at the moment, it looks like a betrayal.
What's your feeling about President Trump's approach to Ukraine? What do you think of Trump and his position on Ukraine?
First step, well done. First step to solve this problem, to make a peace, was what Ukraine must be in the stage as well.
Must be involved.
Must be involved and speak about.
What assurances would you need about security for you to be able to return to your country?
I would say the appearance of the other countries' military there on the front line.
Peacekeepers?
Peacekeepers, yeah.
All four are originally from the Ukrainian capital Kyiv. Marat had started a master's degree in Surrey before the invasion happened.
Can I ask you how you would feel about a peace deal if that peace deal meant that Russia got to keep some of the land it's taken from Ukraine?
I don't like it. I'm thinking first of all of those who laid their lives for this land.
It's not for me to decide. It's not for me to decide, because it's not me fighting in the fields. It's not me dying in the fields. It's not my home was destroyed.
Do you think Ukraine should only settle if it can recover all of its territory?
I understand that everyone is very tired and we have a lot of losses in people. But I can't even imagine how to explain for those who were killed there that it was for nothing.
They discuss hopes of one day returning to Ukraine. Marat, an engineer, of wanting to help the rebuilding process. But they know, despite the talk of a process to end it, the war still rages.
I'm happy to return home as soon as it's safe and secure there. It's my country. There are my family and friends.
And your experience here in Wales over the last couple of years?
For me, it's awesome. The family opened their doors for the people whom they didn't know at all. It's just incredible.
Andy Davis there with the views of Ukrainians in Britain. Well, earlier I talked to Lord Peter Ricketts, who served as the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee and the UK's National Security Advisor. I began by asking him what he thought of Vladimir Putin being brought in from the cold.
That photograph of the US and Russian delegation sitting around a Saudi table is an absolute godsend for the Russians in terms of propaganda. 3 years after their a terrible aggression against Ukraine, the thousands of lives that has cost, the cities that have been smashed, there they are sitting at the top table with the Americans. That is what they would have wanted, of course, and I think it's what Donald Trump wanted. He wanted to get back on terms with the Russians in the hope of a quick deal over Ukraine. I have to say, the signs coming out of Saudi Arabia from Secretary Rubio that this could be a long and difficult negotiation, I think that's rather a good thing, because a short and easy negotiation would, of course, have meant a big win for Putin.
As you say, you've got a dictator wanted by the International Court for war crimes. Apparently that is of absolutely no problem to the host Saudi Arabia and indeed to the United States. Times are changed, are they not?
Times are changed. Of course, the Americans are not party to the International Criminal Court, so they wouldn't have respected that. But it is an enormous change if you think to the Biden administration, which put pretty draconian sanctions on Putin and the Russian regime. Trump is putting all that aside in a rush to do a deal on Ukraine and hoping, I think, to come out with something that he can declare as a famous victory.
You used a telling phrase there, do a deal. When you look at the communique from the US State Department, this looks rather like trade talks dressed up as peace talks, does it not?
It does. And remember, this is the peace and security and safety of a European country they're talking about. And it just seems to me extraordinary that they've even engaged talks with the Russians without a proper detailed discussion with President Zelenskyy about what the Ukrainians could accept. So again, this is something that European leaders have to work on. A deal imposed on the Ukrainians without their full participation is going to be a terrible deal for European security and therefore for all of us.
Which brings us to Marco Rubio, and indeed a grain of reality, perhaps. He is saying, as we see, you can't do any real peace deal without the full cooperation and indeed agreement of both Ukraine and the EU. That's one hell of a roll back from the noise we heard from Vice President Vance and so forth in recent days, isn't it?
We've had all kinds of different messages coming out from different parts of the American scene, all of which I think shows that all of this is still in very, very early stages. It's good that Keir Starmer is going to Washington next week so he can get alongside Trump and start explaining some of these to him. And it's much too soon to start talking about peacekeeping arrangements. We haven't got a peace to keep. We're a long way from that at the moment.
Yes, that looked a little naive, did it not, from the Prime Minister talking about boots on the ground, British boots on the ground, when, as you say, we are nowhere near anything like any peace to keep.
To be honest, I was very sceptical from the start about this talk about peacekeeping troops. First of all, that means to me putting your troops between two adversaries, Russia and Ukraine, prepared to keep them apart and, if necessary, fight the Russians. I don't think European publics and parliaments, including Britain, would have accepted that. Secondly, I'm not at all surprised to hear now the Russians are saying, no way are we going to accept NATO troops in Ukraine. Of course they'd say that. They don't want to have Ukraine's friends deploying troops on their border with Ukraine. So I don't think peacekeeping is the right concept. Maybe we can get an agreement that we'll have some British forces, French forces, others in a kind of stabilizing, reassuring role, not on the front line, but supporting Ukrainian forces. That's the only way I can see having European forces deployed in Ukraine. Even that, the Russians are going to make a lot of noise about.
Lord Ricketts, thanks very much indeed.
Thanks a lot.
Well, what about the view from Europe? A short while ago, I spoke to the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Stefan Löfven. I asked him if after a dramatic week, he thought that 75 years of consensus in the West is now finished.
We haven't seen the final outcome, but I think as Europeans, we have to just acknowledge that the good contact that we've had for decades and decades is not the same anymore. It still remains to see, but we do have a serious problem between the United States and Europe.
And these are words that you probably never thought you would utter in your own lifetime.
No, I think not. But I met President Trump in 2018 in the White House, bilateral. And when at the time, you know, there was these discussions about steel tariffs. And I tried to explain to the president that Europe is not the problem here. It is not we that are lowering the prices. It's China. So I said, EU is not a problem. And then he looked at me and he said, well, EU has been founded just to cause problems for the United States. So that is his view about the European Union.
And that seems to be the view that he and his people are acting on right now.
Exactly. And furthermore, another very important topic was NATO. At the time, Sweden was not a member of NATO, so I explained to the president that Sweden is not a member, but we do have a good cooperation with NATO. And his reply was, oh, so you're not a member, but you cooperate with NATO. Then he looked at his delegation and told State Secretary Tillerson at the time, perhaps that could be something for us. So those were two very, for me, very odd and surprising messages from the American president.
I mean, your country has really had to jump over hurdles to get into NATO after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Do you think you're now safer off in a NATO to which America does not seem to be quite as wedded as it was in the past?
Well, first, everything changed with the Russian invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That altered everything. And of course, this is now a cooperation that is important for Sweden. We want to contribute the best way we can. And with or without the United States, we need to make sure that we stick together as Europeans and do the utmost we can. That means also increasing military expenditure.
But there's also the question of troops. Europe is still not speaking with one voice.
No, I wouldn't agree on that. I would say Europe is united in the cause of making sure that we will do our best to defend Ukraine, because Russia cannot win this war. That is a common message from the European leaders, European countries. The troops on the ground in a very later stage is a question that will be resolved sooner or later. It doesn't have to be resolved today, because today we have Russia and US sitting in Saudi Arabia, not even including Ukraine, not including Europe.
A senior American official said that the children don't get to sit at the table with the adults. And by children, he meant the Europeans, us. What's your response to him?
Well, I think it's more childish to try to exclude very important players, and I don't understand the thinking about from US to push away one of your most important allies in this very, very important moment.
Stefan Löfven, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.